Okay, Trevor, you're tenured.
Hello, I'm Ben Orth.
And I'm Liz Rance.
And I'm Jared Rogers.
Today, we'll be discussing offshore oil extraction.
Specifically, we'll be looking into policies on drilling for oil in the Gulf of Mexico.
There are three pieces of legislation we will be discussing. First is the Submerged Lands Act of 1953, the Outer Continental Lands Act of 1978, and the Gulf of Mexico Energy Securities Act of 2006.
In 2010, the United States consumed 5.4 billion barrels of oil. 3.4 billion of those barrels were imported. OPEC nations make up 1.66 billion barrels of the imports. The rest of the world comprises the other 1.73 billion barrels.
In 2006, the Bureau of Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement estimated that there are 44.92 billion barrels of undiscovered, technically recoverable oil in the Gulf of Mexico.
Offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico accounts for 29% of total U.S. crude oil production and roughly 5.8 million barrels of oil in 2010.
Offshore drilling first started in 1887 off the coast of California. Until the 1950s, the regulation of offshore drilling was basically non-existent, as there were only about 49 production wells in operation.
But as technology advanced, these offshore sites became much easier to access, and the number of platforms began to increase exponentially.
The Submerged Lands Act of 1953 was among the first pieces of legislation passed regulating offshore drilling. This act grants the federal government ownership and jurisdiction of all submerged lands located on the majority of the continental margin, with states retaining the rights to the natural resources within 3 nautical miles of the coastline.
Beginning with the 1978 amendment to the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, government policy regulating access to offshore drilling has been operated through a leasing program. Every 5 years, the Secretary of the Interior declares the location and quantity of the lease and then accepts proposals from potential drilling companies. Leases represent $5.8 billion in revenue to the U.S. government.
Current offshore drilling lease sites are located in central and western portions of the Gulf of Mexico and off parts of the Alaskan coast. Access is limited or completely restricted off the Pacific coast, the northern and southern Atlantic coast, and the eastern Gulf of Mexico, bordering Florida.
But why are some offshore areas restricted and others not? To find the answer to this question, we examine the policy surrounding the moratorium of drilling in what is known as the Eastern Planning Zone of the Gulf of Mexico.
The Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act of 2006 amended previous legislation surrounding offshore drilling in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. Specifically, this act sought to protect a tourist-based, environmentally conscious Florida economy.
With only 3.9 billion barrels of undiscovered, technically recoverable oil, the Eastern Planning Region does not represent a significant drilling location, considering the rest of the Gulf contains 41 billion barrels. Because of this, the 2006 legislation was able to be passed and protects Florida's coast and economy from spills.
The Oil Pollution Act of 1990 caps company liability at $75 million for economic damages to states from an oil spill. However, companies are required to pay for all costs associated with the cleanup of an oil spill.
While BP is going above this cap by establishing a $20 billion fund for the recent spill, legally companies cannot be held liable for more than this $75 million.
The 2010 Deepwater Horizon spill created an estimated $22.7 billion impact to the Gulf state's tourism economy over 3 years.
Based on state GDPs and tourism income as a percent of sales tax, we determined that the states will lose $4.9 billion over the same 3-year period from decreased tourism alone.
Before we established our preferred policy, our group decided to interview Dr. Poitras, an economics professor here at UD, and ask him some questions about regulating the Gulf of Mexico offshore drilling market.
Now, I don't see any reason why the government should be involved in any way with moratoriums or saying that you can't drill at all, you can't drill here, you can't drill there. If the parties bear the cost themselves. There's never been a problem, and economic theory predicts that you get an efficient outcome as long as the parties involved bear the full costs of their actions themselves and also reap the full benefit of their actions themselves.
While the idea of a self-regulating market works in theory, our group believes that government regulation will be necessary to hold companies accountable for their own. Good.
Our ideal policy would remove the $75 million cap entirely. holding companies directly liable for all cleanup and economic costs. However, to remove legislation such as this is difficult. In light of this, our suggested policy increases states' revenue from submerged land leases.
Currently, all 50 states receive a total of $75.8 million from the total $5.8 billion in lease revenues collected by the federal government. That money is divided between all 50 states, not just the coastal states.
As stated before, the federal government receives $5.3 billion in lease revenue from the Gulf of Mexico annually. Of the $5.3 billion, the 50 states share just over $75 million, which, if divided evenly, leaves $1.5 million per state.
Based on our research, we have determined that an impact of $1.3 billion has been incurred through the loss of revenue from sales tax on tourism alone because of the recent oil spill. Considering the amount of damage incurred from an oil spill by the 5 Gulf states, we believe that each state deserves a share of lease revenue proportional to the potential cost on their economy.
Assuming that a major oil spill occurs once every 15 years, we divide the potential cost by 15 in order to determine the amount of money each state should accumulate in a year. At the end of 15 years, this amount would cover the expected economic damages in the event of an oil spill.
Based on the amount of money each state needs to accrue in 1 year, we have used these figures to calculate the suggested percentage of lease revenue that each Gulf state should receive. As you can see, each state receives a different percentage based on their share of costs, with Texas receiving the largest percent and Mississippi receiving the least. Overall, you can see that the Gulf of Mexico states will only represent 1.72% of all lease revenues.
So today we talked about a few things. First, we went over the basics of offshore drilling and a high-level overview of U.S. oil consumption.
And then we went on to discuss the policies on regulating drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. We discussed to you the Submerged Lands Act of 1953, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act of 1978, and also the Gulf of Mexico Energy Securities Act of 2006.
Finally, we talked about our suggested policy, which is to correlate the percent of lease revenue each state receives directly with the potential economic impact of another major oil spill.
Cheers!
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?